They called her dependent, a single word written in ink, but strong enough to erase years of sacrifice. Yet somewhere between the silence of the prairie and the lies hidden in ledgers, a truth was waiting to be uncovered. And when it finally surfaced, it would shake an entire town. What really happened on that Kansas ranch? Let's find out.
4:30 in the morning. That's when the Kansas wind is sharpest. That's when the world is honest. Eleanor Nell Calloway was already awake, out the door before the sun even thought about rising over the Flint Hills. She didn't do it because she was forced to. She did it because this hour, before the children woke, before the dirt demanded her sweat, this hour belonged to her. She walked the fence line, checked on the Hereford cattle, 47 head, and she knew every single one by name, not cute names. Nell didn't have time for cute, functional names. Breezy Hawk for the bull with a bad back right joint. Too White for the cow that threw twins last spring. Slow March, the oldest milker who still earned her keep. She knew where each of them was in their cycle. She knew that the new well in the northeast corner had to be dug deep before summer hit, or the herd wouldn't survive August. She knew the dirt. She knew it by smell. She knew it by the way it crumbled in her calloused palms. Her husband Thomas had been a good man, a kind man. He was the one who rode into town back in '78. He was the one who drove the stakes. He was the one who signed the bank papers for the loan. But Thomas had been in the ground for 4 years now, and while his name was on the parchment, Nell's blood was in the soil. She was the one who planted the maple windbreak to block the winter snows. She was the one who figured out the west pasture held too much water for corn. Let me tell you a hard truth, and I want you to hear this clearly. History often only records the name of the man who held the pen to sign the deed. But the land itself remembers every drop of sweat from the woman who actually tamed it. A woman's labor is so often invisible in the financial ledgers of the world. People look right past it. Yet, it is that exact invisible labor that serves as the very foundation keeping a family and a homestead from collapsing. Equality isn't a gift men hand down to women. It is the simple, undeniable recognition of the work women are already doing. And the bank in Milford? They didn't recognize a damn thing. When the mail arrived that afternoon, Nell opened an envelope from Harlan and Sons Bank. It was a notice of debt, a recalculation of interest. But it wasn't the dollar amount that made Nell's jaw lock. It was the name at the top. Calloway Estate. E. Calloway. Dependent. Dependent. There it was again, that word. As if she were just a guest in her own home. As if 4 years of raising 2 kids alone, paying down the principal alone, and keeping the roof from caving in alone was just a footnote. Nell didn't scream. She didn't throw the letter into the hearth. Frontier women don't have time to waste on useless tears. Crying doesn't pay the mortgage. Instead, she waited until the sun went down. Until Henry and Sarah were asleep. Then she pulled down a heavy leather-bound book she had borrowed from a judge 2 counties over. Kansas Statutes Annotated, 1885 edition. She opened it to the light of a single oil lamp. She started reading. She was going to find a way to turn her invisible labor into hard, measurable, legal proof. She was going to fight a system that refused to see her. She was deep into page 47 when she heard it. The crunch of gravel, a horse drawing near. Nell stood up. She walked to the window and pushed back the curtain. The sun was gone, leaving the prairie painted in dark, bruising purples. A buggy rolled up the drive. Not a farmer's wagon, a polished city buggy. The horse stopped. A man stepped down into the dust. He didn't look like a soft banker. He was tall, broad-shouldered. He had the undeniable build of a rancher, a man who knew how to break a horse. But he was wearing the tailored coat of a wealthy man, a man from the city. It was James Harlan McCready, the heir to the biggest ranch in the county, and the new owner of the very bank that was trying to erase her name. He stood by the gate, looking at her house. Nell let the curtain fall. She didn't flinch. She just walked to the door, opened it, and stepped out onto the porch to meet the storm. James Harlan McCready didn't want to come back. Not really. St. Louis was clean. The law there was clean. It lived on crisp white paper. It was debated in rooms that smelled of floor wax and expensive cigars. Out here in Milford, the law lived in the dirt. His father was dead, a sudden heart giving out in the middle of a Tuesday. And just like that, James had to pack up 12 years of a successful city life, board a westbound train, and inherit a kingdom he hadn't asked for. The Harlan and Sons Bank, 3 massive cattle ranches, and a ledger book full of names. He spent his first 30 days back in Kansas just trying to read his father's handwriting. It was a mess. His father had run the bank on handshakes and whiskey promises. James didn't operate that way. He operated on facts, on numbers. Numbers didn't lie to you. Numbers didn't get sick. 3 years ago, James had lost his wife. She had tried to tell him she felt weak. She had tried to tell him something was wrong. He hadn't listened closely enough. He'd trusted the doctors instead of trusting her. When she died, something in James broke. He stopped listening to feelings. He started living strictly by the data. But the problem with data is that it only tells the truth if the person writing it down is honest. And Victor Aldridge was not an honest man. Aldridge was the biggest cattle shipper in the county. He had a silver pocket watch, a perfectly trimmed beard, and a smile that never quite reached his eyes. He had been James's father's unofficial advisor for years. Aldridge found James on his very first day in the bank. He poured James a glass of bourbon and laid a map on the desk. A false map. "It's a tragedy, really," Aldridge had said, tapping a manicured finger on the Calloway property line. "Thomas Calloway was a decent sort, but he passed. Now his widow is out there. Poor woman. She's unstable, James. Completely in over her head. The debt is piling up. The fences are rotting. The humane thing, the right thing, is to foreclose before winter. Save her from herself. Give her a clean break." James had taken out his pen. He had written in his notebook, Calloway. Assess for foreclosure by April 30th. Let me pause the story right here because there is a lesson you need to hear out loud. There is a very specific kind of danger in a powerful man's sympathy. When a man in power pities a woman, when he calls her unstable or overwhelmed, he is usually preparing to steal from her. Pity is the mask that greed wears when it wants to look respectable. Society will always applaud a man who claims he is saving a weak woman, even as he kicks her out of her own home. James believed Aldridge. Why wouldn't he? It fit the numbers. So, on a Tuesday afternoon, James rented a polished black buggy and drove out to the Calloway spread. He expected ruin. He expected sagging roofs. He expected starving cattle and a weeping woman standing on a broken porch. He crossed the property line. The fences were straight. The wire was taut. He drove further. He saw the Hereford cattle grazing in the lower pasture. They were thick, healthy. Their coats shone in the late afternoon sun. He pulled the buggy into the yard. The barn had fresh hinges. The water trough was full and clean. This wasn't the picture Aldridge had painted. James stepped down from the buggy. He brushed the road dust from his tailored city coat. He looked toward the house. Nell Calloway was standing on the porch. She didn't look like a woman who needed saving. She wore a faded blue work dress. Her hands were bare, resting on the wooden rail. She didn't come down to greet him. She made him walk the distance to her steps. He stopped at the bottom stair. He took off his hat. "Mrs. Calloway, I am James McCready. I represent the bank." "I know who you are," Nell said. Her voice was flat, calm. "I came out here to assess the condition of the property," James said. He slipped into his city lawyer voice. It was a shield. "Before the bank makes a final decision on your debt, my father left notes indicating there were concerns about the sustainability of the operation." "Your father never set foot on this property," Nell said. James blinked. "He never saw this ranch with his own eyes," Nell continued. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. He only saw what Victor Aldridge told him to see. James felt a tight knot form in his chest. Aldridge's name wasn't supposed to come up this fast. "Would you be willing to show me your ledger books?" James asked. "I could," Nell said. She looked down at him. Her eyes were sharp, evaluating him not as a threat, but as a puzzle. "But first, perhaps you could show me the exact clause in the original 1880 contract that allows the bank to adjust a principal debt after the ink has dried?" Silence hung in the yard. Only the sound of the wind moving through the tall grass. James stared at her. That wasn't the question of an unstable widow. That wasn't the question of a desperate woman. That was the question of someone who knew the law better than the banker standing in her yard. Who taught her that, he wondered. He didn't ask it out loud, but she saw the question in his eyes. "I don't need a clean break, Mr. Macready," Nell said softly. "I need an honest accounting." She turned and walked back into her house. The screen door clicked shut. James stood there alone. He looked around the immaculate yard one last time. Then he climbed back into his buggy. As he drove back toward town, his hands gripped the leather reins tight. He had been given the wrong map. He knew it now. Someone was lying, and he was going to find out exactly who it was. A day on the Callaway Ranch didn't start with coffee and conversation. It started in the dark. 6 o'clock the next morning. The sun was just a rumor on the horizon. Nell was in the barn. One of the new calves, she called him Breezy Hawk, was limping. His right hind joint was swollen tight. A lesser farmer would have called for the town veterinarian. That would cost $3. $3 was a week's worth of flour and sugar. Nell didn't call the vet. She went to the pantry. She mixed ginger root with rendered beef tallow. She heated it over a small tin stove. She had learned this from an old Cherokee woman at the county market 3 years ago. Nobody ever asked Nell where she learned her medicine. They only asked if her cows survived the winter. They always did. She rubbed the warm salve into the calf's leg. The animal breathed out, leaning its heavy head against her shoulder. She patted its neck. By 10 o'clock, the sun was high. The cattle buyer arrived, Mr. Bauer, a heavy-set man who chewed unlit cigars and always offered 15% below market value on his first bid. Nell met him at the corral. "Morning, Widow Callaway," Bauer said. He tipped his hat, but his eyes were already scanning the herd, doing the math. "Rough winter. Cattle are looking a little lean. I can take 8 head off your hands. Give you top dollar, considering the circumstances." He named a price. It was insulting. Nell didn't get angry. Anger was a luxury she couldn't afford. "Mr. Bauer," she said smoothly, "the Kansas City market sheet came into the post office yesterday. Prime beef is up 2 cents a pound. My 8 steers average 1,100 pounds each. I weighed them yesterday on the pivot board. I'll take 12% above your offer. Not a penny less." Bauer stopped chewing his cigar. He looked at her. He realized she had done the math. She knew the market. "Now, Nell," he chuckled, trying to sound friendly, "you shouldn't trouble your head with those city numbers. Let me help you out." Nell held his gaze. "I'm not asking for help, Mr. Bauer. I'm stating my price." He paid it. He didn't like it, but he paid it. "I need you to understand something crucial right here. Please listen to this verbal truth. Independence for a woman is not just about making her own money or doing the hard labor. True independence requires the courage to firmly reject unsolicited help. Often, men will offer help that is actually designed to undermine a woman's confidence and keep her in a position of weakness. Refusing that kind of patronizing assistance, politely but absolutely, is a profound act of self-respect. Nell had learned that the hard way. By 2 o'clock, she drove the wagon into Milford for supplies. She didn't stop to gossip. She went straight to Clara Voss's fabric shop. Clara was 67, a German immigrant with hands stained from indigo dye. She was the only person in town who knew the whole truth about Nell's farm. The shop smelled of cedarwood and fresh cotton. It was quiet. It was safe. Nell sat heavily in a wooden chair near the counter. "Macready came to the farm," Nell said. Clara didn't stop measuring out a length of blue linen. "Did he look at your books?" "No," Nell said. "I wouldn't let him. I want to see what he really wants first." Clara clipped the fabric with heavy iron shears. His father was a good man when it was convenient to be a good man. What about the son? We will see, Clara said gently. But don't wait too long for him to figure it out, Nell. A good man who is too slow to act is no different than a bad man. That night, Friday night, the house was completely silent. The children, Henry and Sarah, were asleep in the back room. Nell sat at the kitchen table. The oil lamp burned low, casting long, wavering shadows against the log walls. Spread out before her were the bank letters, the foreclosure warning, the demands for money she didn't owe. There is a kind of tired that gets into your bones. Sleep doesn't fix it. Only surrendering fixes it. For 10 long minutes, Nell just sat there, staring at the paper. I could sell, she thought. The thought came uninvited. It wasn't a desperate thought. It was cold mathematics. If she sold the herd and the land, she would clear about $2,000. She could move into town, buy a small house, send Henry to a good school. She wouldn't have to fight the bank. She wouldn't have to freeze her hands in the winter mud. She wouldn't have to be called a dependent anymore. It would be so easy. She let the thought sit there in the room with her. It felt warm. It felt like a heavy blanket. Then she stood up. She walked to the window and looked out into the pitch-black night. She couldn't see them, but she knew they were there. The maples. She and Thomas had planted them as saplings 9 years ago. She had watered them by hand, carrying buckets from the creek. She had planted them knowing she wouldn't see them fully grown for a decade. She had planted them for the future. If I leave, she thought, they take my future. They take it just by spelling my name wrong on a piece of paper, and I am letting them do it. Nell turned away from the window. The warmth of surrender was gone, replaced by a cold, sharp iron in her chest. She sat back down at the table. She opened the heavy Kansas statutes law book. She took out a fresh blank sheet of paper and uncorked a bottle of black ink. She dipped her steel pen. She began to write. She wrote down every fence she built. She wrote down every dollar she paid ahead of schedule in 1883. She wrote down the exact date she negotiated the water rights. She wrote down every piece of invisible labor and attached a date and a number to it. She was going to make the invisible visible. She was going to build a paper trail that no man in a suit could burn down. The grandfather clock in the corner ticked. 11 o'clock, 12 o'clock, 1 in the morning. She kept writing. Outside on the county road, a lone horseman was riding back toward town. It was James McCready. He had been at a late meeting with Aldridge, listening to the man spin more lies. As James rode past the Callaway property line, he turned his head. The rest of the prairie was swallowed in absolute darkness. But there, in the window of the Callaway farmhouse, a single light burned. James pulled his horse to a halt. He sat in the saddle, the cold wind pulling at his coat. He looked at that square of yellow light. He could see her silhouette through the glass, bent over the table, working, writing. Nobody stays up writing at 1 in the morning if they are giving up. James didn't ride up to the house. He didn't knock. But as he nudged his horse forward toward town, the false map in his head finally tore perfectly in half. Aldridge was lying. The bank was wrong. And the widow Callaway was preparing for war. Nell didn't go to the bank. If you want to fight a man who controls the money, you don't fight him in the room where he counts it. You fight him in the room where the rules are written. It was a Tuesday morning. The wind had died down, leaving the air thick and still. Nell hitched the wagon, drove the 5 miles into Milford, and tied her horse to the post outside the county courthouse. She walked up the wooden steps. Her boots struck the floorboards with a heavy, steady rhythm. She carried a leather satchel. Inside was the list she had written by the light of the oil lamp. Judge Elias Harding was a man of 62. He had been the county magistrate for 20 years. He was used to seeing women in his office. Usually they came in weeping. Usually they came in asking for an allowance from a drunk husband or begging for more time on a tax payment. Nell Callaway didn't weep. She didn't beg. She sat in the hard wooden chair across from his desk. She opened her satchel. She laid her papers out flat. Judge Harding, Nell said. Her voice was calm, steady. I am not asking the court to take action today. I am asking you to enter this into the official county record. Harding put on his spectacles. He looked at the paper, then he looked at her. This is an itemized ledger of physical labor and structural improvements, Harding said, his brow furrowing. To the Callaway property. Yes, Nell said. Backed by dates. Backed by receipts for lumber and wire. And I have included a transcription of Section 47, Paragraph 3 of the 1883 Kansas statutes regarding the vested property rights of a surviving spouse who has tangibly contributed to the estate. Harding leaned back in his chair. The leather creaked. He looked at Nell as if he were seeing her for the first time. Women didn't quote the Kansas statutes. They weren't supposed to know the Kansas statutes existed. Mrs. Callaway, the bank has wide latitude. The bank has a contract, Nell interrupted politely but firmly. A contract my husband signed in 1880. A contract that does not contain a clause for arbitrary interest adjustments. I want it on the legal record that I am contesting the bank's reclassification of my account. I want it on the record before they try to foreclose. Harding stared at her for a long time. Then he picked up his pen. He stamped the paper. He entered it into the ledger. He didn't do it because he thought she would win. He did it because she had followed the exact letter of the law, and he had no legal right to refuse her. Nell thanked him. She packed her satchel. She walked out. But a small town is a living, breathing thing. It has eyes. It has a mouth. And it talks fast. By noon, the whole town of Milford knew that the widow Callaway had gone to the judge to sue the bank. That wasn't what she did, of course. But gossip doesn't care about the truth. Gossip only cares about the drama. Nell walked over to Peterson's Mercantile to buy coffee beans. The bell above the door jingled. Inside, 3 women were standing by the flour barrels. One of them was Harriet Morton. She was the wife of the town council head. She wore a dress with too much lace for a Tuesday. Harriet didn't lower her voice when Nell walked in. In fact, she raised it. I just don't understand what she wants, Harriet said to the other women, looking right past Nell. The bank has been more than generous. They should have taken that land 2 years ago, but no. Give some people an inch and they drag you to court. Ungrateful. It's just difficult behavior. Nell was standing 4 feet away. She heard every single word. She stopped. Her hand tightened on her leather satchel. Her jaw locked. Let me step in here and tell you a hard truth about how the world works. Listen to this closely. The price a woman pays for speaking the truth and standing up for her rights is that society will immediately brand her as crazy, difficult, or ungrateful. Society is always quicker to forgive a weak soul who needs saving than a strong woman who demands what she has earned. When a woman refuses to be a victim, the world often tries to make her the villain. Nell knew this. She felt the heat rising in her chest. She wanted to turn around. She wanted to scream at Harriet Morton. She wanted to ask Harriet how many winter calves she had pulled from the mud, but she didn't. She paid Mr. Peterson for her coffee. She turned. She walked out the door. She held her head high and kept her dignity intact. Across the street, inside the bank, James McCready was fighting his own battle. Victor Aldridge was standing in James's office. He had a cigar in one hand and a piece of paper in the other. It was a formal order of foreclosure for the Callaway Ranch. Sign it, James, Aldridge said. His voice was smooth, too smooth. The woman just went to Judge Harding. She's causing a stir. We need to nip this in the bud. Protect the bank's assets. Sign the paper and the sheriff will have her out by Friday, for her own good. James looked at the paper. He looked at the pen on his desk. In St. Louis, he would have signed it. The numbers said the account was delinquent. The numbers said foreclose. But he kept seeing Nell Callaway standing on her porch. He kept seeing her handwriting in the window at midnight. He kept hearing her ask him about the original contract clause. I need to review the original deed, James said. Aldridge frowned. The smooth mask slipped just for a second. James, your father would have signed this yesterday. My father is dead, James said softly. I am sitting in this chair, and I don't sign my name to things I haven't read. Time is of the essence here, Aldridge pressed. My time, James replied. He looked up at Aldridge. Thank you, Victor, that will be all. Aldridge left the office. The door clicked shut. James was alone. He picked up the pen. He held it over the foreclosure order. One stroke of ink, and the problem goes away. He set the pen down. He didn't sign it. His hesitation was a choice. Late that afternoon, the sun was sinking low, casting long, golden shadows across the plains. Nell was out by the corral, fixing a broken rail. She heard a horse approach. She turned around. It was James McCready. He wasn't in a buggy this time. He was riding a tall bay gelding. He rode well. Like a man born to the saddle, not a man born to a desk. He stopped at the fence line. He dismounted. He didn't bring a briefcase. He didn't look like a banker. Mrs. Calloway, James said. Nell held her hammer. Mr. McCready, if you're looking for my land deed, it's with the judge. I know, James said. That's why I'm here. He reached into his coat pocket. He pulled out a small, worn copy of the Kansas statutes. You cited Section 47, James said. He looked at her, his eyes searching hers. I read it, twice. A lawyer from the city would say it only applies to commercial partnerships, not marriages. A lawyer from the city didn't build this ranch, Nell said. James nodded slowly. No, he didn't. He stepped closer to the fence. I came here to ask you a question, James said. His voice dropped. It lost the polished professional edge. It sounded human. I want you to tell me how you read that law. I want you to explain it to me, not as a banker, just explain it to me. Nell looked at him, really looked at him. He wasn't here to threaten her, he wasn't here to pity her, he was here to learn. She lowered the hammer. Tie your horse to the post, Mr. McCready, Nell said. Let me tell you how the law works out here in the dirt. James McCready didn't call it an investigation. Lawyers don't like that word. It implies a crime. James preferred to call it clarifying the record. But whatever you called it, he spent the next 3 days buried in the basement of his own bank. He pulled the files, not just the Calloway file. He pulled the ledgers for every farm in the county that was currently facing foreclosure. He sat at a small wooden table under a flickering gas lamp. He ran his finger down the columns of numbers, and a pattern began to emerge. A cold, ugly pattern. There were 7 farms in deep trouble. All 7 had their interest rates suddenly adjusted upward in the last 3 years. He looked at the names. Rosa Mendez, a Mexican widow. Lars Eriksson, a Norwegian immigrant who barely spoke English. Eleanor Calloway, a widow with no male relatives nearby. Not a single large cattle operation, not a single prominent townsman. Only the vulnerable, only the people who didn't have the money to hire a lawyer to read the fine print. And worse, all 7 of those farms bordered the new railroad spur, the exact land Victor Aldridge was trying to buy up for his cattle shipping empire. It wasn't a coincidence. It was a trap. James closed the ledgers. The dust in the basement suddenly felt thick, hard to breathe. He needed air. He needed to see the real world. He rode back out to the Calloway Ranch. This was his 3rd visit. He told himself he was going out there to evaluate the livestock, to put a true dollar value on the assets. But that was a lie. He went out there because he needed to see her work. He needed to see the truth with his own eyes. When he arrived, Nell was in the barn. She was kneeling in the straw. The calf with the bad joint was standing now, putting weight on the leg. James leaned against the wooden stall. He watched her run her hands over the animal's leg. Her movements were sure, confident. He's standing, James noted. He is, Nell said, not looking up. The swelling is down, the joint is warm, but the fever broke in the night. You didn't use the town vet. The town vet uses leeches and whiskey, Nell said dryly. She stood up, wiping her hands on an old rag. I use ginger root and tallow. Draws the heat out, keeps the blood moving. James looked at her. Where did you study animal husbandry, Mrs. Calloway? I didn't study it, Nell said. I lived it. When you have 47 head of cattle and no money, you learn how to keep them alive. You ask the natives, you ask the old-timers. You try things until something works, and then you write it down. She looked James square in the eye. I need you to understand this, Mr. McCready, Nell said. Her voice was firm. There are two kinds of knowledge in this world. There is institutional knowledge, the kind you learn in a warm room from a book. And there is lived knowledge, the kind you learn when failure means your children don't eat. Both are valuable, but only one of them will keep you alive in a blizzard. Don't ever make the mistake of thinking a person is ignorant just because they don't hold a piece of paper from a university. James let the words hit him. He didn't deflect them. He absorbed them. He had spent his whole life relying on institutional knowledge. He had relied on the doctors in St. Louis when his wife got sick. He had trusted their books over her own lived knowledge of her failing body. And she had died. You're right, James said quietly. The air in the barn was still. Nell paused. She hadn't expected him to agree so easily. I looked at the bank records, James continued. He kept his voice low. The official ledger says your payment history is irregular. But I found a handwritten note from my father, from 1883. It said you paid 3 months ahead of schedule. It called you reliable. Nell stared at him. You know then? I know the records don't match, James said. I have known that since 1885, Nell said. Her voice was tinged with a deep, old exhaustion. I knew the numbers were wrong, but nobody would let me explain. Because I am a woman. Because I am a dependent. James stepped closer. I'm listening now. It's too late for just listening, Nell said. She walked past him, out of the barn and into the bright sunlight. James followed her. I found a pattern, James admitted to her back. It's not just you, it's Lars Eriksson. It's Rosa Mendez. 7 farms, all of them vulnerable. All of them having their interest rates manipulated. Nell stopped. She turned around. The wind whipped a stray strand of hair across her cheek. How long have you known this? She demanded. James didn't look away. I suspected it 2 weeks ago. I confirmed it yesterday. 2 weeks, Nell said. The betrayal in her voice was quiet, but it cut deep. You sat in your office for 2 weeks while Aldridge pushed for foreclosure, while Harriet Morton called me crazy in the street. I was gathering facts, James said, though the defense sounded hollow even to him. A lawyer doesn't act until he has proof. A decent man acts when he sees a fire, Nell fired back. He doesn't wait to measure the temperature of the flames. James closed his eyes for a second. She was right. Clara Voss had been right. A good man who is too slow to act is no different than a bad man. I lost 2 weeks because I was scared, James said. The confession hung in the air between them. Bare. Honest. I was scared to find out that my father built his bank on a lie. And in those 2 weeks your life got harder. That is my fault. That is my cross to bear. Nell looked at him. She saw the shame in his eyes. It was real. But apologies don't fix ledgers. Go back to your bank, Mr. McCready, Nell said softly. Find the rest of the truth, because there is a piece missing. Aldridge is just a cattle shipper. He didn't write the contracts. Someone in your family gave him the weapon he's using against us. James rode back to town fast. He pushed the bay gelding hard. He didn't go to his office. He went straight back down to the basement. Nell was right. Aldridge was corrupt, but he wasn't a banker. Who put the language in the contracts? Who built the trap? James bypassed his father's boxes. He went to the very back of the room, to the dusty cobweb-covered crates from 1875, the year the bank was founded by his grandfather, Silas McCready. He pulled out the original charter. He pulled out the master templates for the agricultural loans. He read the fine print. His blood ran cold. There it was. Section 4, paragraph 9. The Harlan and Sons Bank reserves the right to universally adjust prime interest rates on any holding where the primary signatory is deceased, incapacitated, or legally unrepresented, at the sole discretion of the acting bank manager. It was a clause designed specifically to target people who couldn't fight back. Widows, immigrants, the poor. It wasn't Aldrich who built the trap. It was James's own grandfather. The system wasn't broken. It was working exactly as it was designed to work. It was designed to exploit. And James had just inherited it all. He sat in the dark basement holding the old yellowed paper. He had a choice to make. He could burn the paper. He could sign Nell's foreclosure, silence the noise, and keep his family's empire wealthy and pristine. Or he could strike a match and burn his own house down to save a woman who owed him nothing. A storm in Kansas doesn't sneak up on you. You feel it in your teeth first. The air gets heavy. The birds stop singing. The sky bruises an ugly shade of purple before the first drop of rain ever hits the dirt. Trouble in Milford worked exactly the same way. It was a Thursday evening. The town council met in the back room of the courthouse. The air was thick with pipe smoke and the smell of damp wool. Victor Aldrich stood at the front of the room. He wore a crisp suit. He had the undivided attention of 5 councilmen. "Gentlemen," Aldrich said. His voice was smooth as warm molasses. "We are facing an economic crisis. The bank has several agricultural holdings that are deeply delinquent. Properties are falling into disrepair. It brings down the value of the whole county. I propose a resolution to allow the bank to expedite foreclosures on accounts over 90 days past due. We need to cut the dead wood to save the tree." James McCready sat in the back row. He didn't have a pipe. He didn't have a smile. He had a knot in his stomach the size of a fist. He knew the truth now. He knew those accounts weren't delinquent. They were rigged. Rigged by his own grandfather's hidden claws. Aldrich was just pulling the trigger on a gun the McCready family had loaded. James looked at the men voting. Harriet Morton's husband raised his hand, then another, then a third. The resolution passed. All James had to do was stand up. All he had to do was say, "Wait. The ledgers are a lie." But he didn't. He sat there, paralyzed by the weight of his own name. If he spoke up, he wouldn't just be ruining Aldrich. He would be tearing down the Harlan Bank. He would be calling his own bloodline a family of thieves. His silence was a choice, and out on the prairie silence always has a body count. The very next morning, the deputy rode out to the Callaway ranch. He didn't stay for coffee. He handed Nell a sealed envelope and rode away fast, like a man who knew he was carrying poison. Nell opened it on the porch. Warning of expedited foreclosure. She had 14 days to pay the fabricated debt in full, or the sheriff would put her furniture in the dirt. Nell didn't cry. She folded the paper. She put it in her apron pocket. Then she walked to the barn and hitched her wagon. She didn't drive into town to beg the bank. She drove south. 5 miles down the road lived Rosa Mendez. Rosa was a widow just like Nell. But Rosa's English was broken, and she was entirely alone. When Nell pulled into the yard, Rosa was sitting on her porch steps, holding the exact same warning letter. Her eyes were red. Nell sat down in the dirt next to her. She took the letter from Rosa's trembling hands. "I don't have the money, Elena," Rosa whispered. "They take my home." "No," Nell said firmly. "They are trying to steal it. There is a difference." Nell spent an hour explaining the law to Rosa. She explained the numbers. She showed Rosa how the bank had illegally jumped her interest rate. Then Nell got back in the wagon. She drove 3 miles west to Lars Eriksson's farm. Lars was a giant of a man from Norway. He was strong enough to lift a calf over his shoulders, but he was staring at his foreclosure warning like it was a ghost. He couldn't read the legal English. To him, the paper was just a death sentence with a government stamp. Nell sat at his rough-hewn table. She translated the words. She translated the lie. "I need to pause the story right here. I need to tell you something true about how the world works, and I need you to hear it clearly. True equality is never just about one person escaping the fire. True equality is about securing your own breath and then turning right back around and running into the smoke to pull the others out. When you hold knowledge, especially legal knowledge, and you share it with people who are kept in the dark, you are handing them a weapon. You are doing the deepest, truest work of democracy. Equality is not a solo victory. If only you survive the rigged game, the system hasn't changed. It just found a different victim. Nell knew that. If she saved only herself, Lars and Rosa would fall. That night, Nell sat at her kitchen table. The lamp was burning bright. She wasn't writing to the local judge anymore. She was aiming higher. She dipped her pen in the inkwell and wrote a letter to the Western Kansas Settlement Society, a group in Lawrence that provided legal aid to immigrants and homesteaders. She listed the 3 farms. She listed the illegal interest jumps. She laid out the pattern. She sealed the envelope with hot wax. She was declaring war, not just for her own land, for the whole damn prairie. 2 days passed. The Kansas wind blew hard, rattling the window panes of the Callaway farmhouse. James McCready rode up the driveway on his bay gelding. He tied the horse to the post. He walked up the wooden steps. He didn't knock like a stranger. He knocked like a man carrying a heavy burden. Nell opened the door. She didn't invite him into the parlor. She led him straight to the kitchen. The kitchen is where the work gets done. It's where the truth lives. They sat across from each other at the scarred wooden table. James reached into his leather satchel. He pulled out a stack of papers. He set them quietly between them. "I found it," James said. His voice was rough, stripped of all its city polish. "I found the root of it." Nell looked at the papers. "What am I looking at, Mr. McCready?" "You are looking at my grandfather's handwriting," James said. He didn't look away from her. He forced himself to hold her gaze. "It's a clause from 1875. It gives the bank the right to manually alter interest rates on accounts held by widows, by immigrants, by anyone without the means to hire legal representation." Nell's breath hitched, just slightly. It was one thing to suspect you were being cheated. It was a completely different thing to see the blueprint of the trap laid out on your own kitchen table. "It wasn't a mistake," Nell said softly. "No," James replied. "It was a strategy. Aldridge is using it to bleed you dry and take the land. But my family built the knife he's using." Nell looked at the man sitting across from her. He looked exhausted. The proud, tailored lawyer from St. Louis was gone. Here was just a man, staring at the sins of his own bloodline. "You knew this," Nell said. Her voice was terrifyingly calm. "You knew there was a pattern. You sat in that town council meeting on Thursday, and you let Aldridge pass that resolution." "I did," James admitted. He didn't offer a single excuse. "I sat there. I stayed quiet." "Why?" "Because I was a coward," James said. The words hit the table like heavy stones. "I lost 2 weeks because I was scared of destroying my father's name. And in those 2 weeks, you suffered. Lars Eriksson suffered. Rosa Mendez suffered. That is my fault, nobody else's." Nell leaned back in her chair. She had spent her whole life listening to men make excuses. Men always blamed the weather, or the market, or God. She had never, not once, heard a man with power simply admit he was a coward. There was a strange kind of honor in his total surrender. "So," Nell said, "what happens now?" "Now," James said, his jaw tightening, "we fight them. Aldridge called for a formal arbitration hearing in town this coming Friday. He thinks he's going to fast-track your foreclosure. He thinks I'm going to sit beside him and rubber stamp it." James leaned forward. "I'm not. I'm going to sit on your side of the table. I'm going to bring these original charters. We're going to rip the floorboards out from under him." For the first time since her husband died, Nell felt a sudden, profound weight lift from her shoulders. She wasn't carrying the wall alone anymore. Someone was standing on the other side, pushing back with her. But James was still a city lawyer. And city lawyers think in terms of juries, judges, and theatrics. That was his fatal flaw. The day before the arbitration, James was pacing his office in town. He had the law on his side, he had the facts, but he knew the men on that arbitration board. They were proud, stubborn, wealthy men. They didn't like being told they were wrong. And they certainly didn't like being told they were wrong by a woman who dug her own wells and negotiated her own cattle prices. To win this, James thought, they need to feel sorry for her. They need to see a helpless widow. If they see a tough, hardened rancher, their pride will make them fight her. James walked out of the bank. He walked down the street to Clara Voss's fabric shop. The bell jingled. Clara looked up from her sewing machine. "Mr. Macready," Clara said. Her eyes were sharp, suspicious. "Clara," James said, taking off his hat, "I need a dress. A widow's dress. The finest black silk you have. Elegant, somber, conservative." Clara stopped pedaling the machine. The needle halted. "A dress," Clara repeated. "For Nell." "For the arbitration tomorrow," James explained, completely oblivious to the ice forming in Clara's eyes. "The board needs to see a respectable, grieving lady. They need to see someone they naturally want to protect. If she walks in there looking like a field hand, they'll harden their hearts against her. It's a matter of optics." Clara stood up. She walked over to the counter. She rested her stained hands on the wood. "You want to dress her up," Clara said softly. "I want to win the case," James countered. "I want to save her ranch. The law is a performance, Clara. I just need her in the right costume." Clara stared at him for a long, heavy moment. "I will sell you the dress, James Macready," Clara said, "because my business is selling clothes, but you are a fool, a blind city fool." James bought the dress. He packed it in a beautiful, stiff white box tied with a black ribbon. He wrote a note and had a messenger boy write it out to the Callaway Ranch that evening. The note read, "Nell, wear this tomorrow. The board needs to see a respectable lady before they will listen. Let me handle the law. See you at 9. James." Let me stop the story here and tell you another truth. Pay attention to this because it happens every day. There is a deep, insidious danger in a man's pity. When a well-meaning man tries to protect a woman by forcing her to play the role of a helpless victim, he is not respecting her. He is caging her. Pity cloaks you in fine silk, but it demands you shrink yourself to fit inside it. True respect doesn't ask a woman to put on a costume to earn her basic human rights. True respect demands that the world looks at her exactly as she is, calluses, dirt, and all, and recognizes her undeniable worth. James thought he was handing Nell a shield. He didn't realize he was handing her an insult. Out on the prairie, the sun went down. Nell Callaway sat in her parlor. The stiff white box was open on the table. The black silk spilled over the edges, soft and expensive. She read James's note. "The board needs to see a respectable lady." She looked down at her own hands. Her knuckles were scarred from barbed wire. Her fingernails were permanently stained with Kansas earth. She looked at the dress. A quiet, dangerous fire lit in her chest. She closed the box. She tied the black ribbon back perfectly. She wasn't going to wear the silk. Tomorrow, she was going to town, and she was going to teach James Macready, Victor Aldridge, and every man on that board exactly what a respectable woman actually looked like. Morning broke over the Flint Hills like a cracked egg, pale yellow light spilling over the dark, bruised horizon. It was Friday, the day of the arbitration. Nell stood in her bedroom. The stiff white box sat on her quilt. She had untied the black ribbon the night before. She had looked at the silk. She had felt its impossible, slippery softness between her calloused fingers. It was a beautiful dress, the kind of dress a wealthy woman wears when she wants the world to know she is mourning, but also that she is safe. Nell closed the box. She walked over to her wooden wardrobe. She pulled out her best work dress. It wasn't silk. It was heavy, durable cotton, faded by the Kansas sun, washed 100 times in the iron tub out back. It was clean. It was mended at the elbows. She put it on. She laced up her leather boots. The leather was scarred from barbed wire and stained with the dark earth of her own pastures. She didn't put on gloves. She left her hands bare. She walked out the door. The town hall in Milford smelled of floor wax, stale coffee, and old cigar smoke. The arbitration room was in the back. It had a long, heavy oak table. 3 men sat on one side. The arbitration board, men who owned the feed store, the lumber yard, and the mill. Men who liked their ledgers clean and their women quiet. Victor Aldridge sat at the end of the table. He looked relaxed. He wore a silver tie pin. He had a stack of papers neatly squared in front of him. The heavy double doors opened. Nell walked in. The room went entirely silent. Aldridge's smug smile faltered. The men on the board shifted in their heavy wooden chairs. They had expected a weeping widow in black silk. They had expected someone they could pity, someone they could gently usher out of her own home while feeling like gentlemen. Instead, Nell Calloway walked to the table in the clothes that built their town. She looked like the dirt they walked on, and she stood as tall as a church steeple. James McCready was already in the room. He was standing by the window. When he saw her, his breath caught. He looked at her bare, calloused hands. He looked at her faded dress. And in that singular moment, James realized exactly what a fool he had been. He didn't walk over to Aldridge's side of the table. He walked over to Nell. He pulled out the chair for her. He sat down right beside her. "Let's begin," the chairman said, clearing his throat. Aldridge stood up. He used his smooth molasses voice. He talked about delinquent accounts. He talked about the tragedy of a woman trying to run a man's operation. He talked about the bank's generous patience. Nell didn't interrupt. She let him talk. She let him build a house out of straw. When Aldridge finished, the chairman looked at Nell. "Mrs. Calloway," he said gently, too gently. "Do you have anything to say regarding the debt?" Nell stood up. She didn't look at James. She didn't look at Aldridge. She looked dead into the eyes of the 3 men on the board. "I don't have a story," Nell said. Her voice was steady. It didn't shake. "I have mathematics." She laid her ledger on the table. "In 1883, I paid 3 months ahead of schedule. The bank received it. But the ledger recorded an arbitrary interest jump of 4%. She placed a second paper down. "This is the original loan contract my husband signed. There is no clause permitting that jump." She placed a third paper down. It was yellowed and old. James had given it to her. "And this," Nell said, her voice dropping an octave, "is the internal bank charter from 1875, outlining a deliberate strategy to alter interest rates on accounts held by widows and immigrants. A strategy Mr. Aldridge here has been using to bleed 7 different farms dry in order to buy the land cheap for the new railroad spur." The room was so quiet you could hear the dust settling. Aldridge's face lost all its color. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. Nell placed both of her bare, rough hands flat on the oak table. "I do not owe the Harlan Bank $980, Nell said. "The Harlan Bank owes me $480 in stolen interest, and I am here to collect." It didn't take an hour. Facts are stubborn things. When you drag them out into the light, they don't leave much room for debate. The board had no choice. The paper trail was absolute. They ruled in her favor. Aldridge was ordered to refund the stolen money. The meeting adjourned. The men scrambled out of the room like rats running from a grass fire. Nell packed her papers into her leather satchel. James stood beside her. He didn't speak. He just watched her. Nell walked out of the town hall. She didn't go to her wagon. She walked straight down the wooden boardwalk, heading for the Harlan Bank. James followed her. She walked into his private office. She set her satchel on the floor. The white box with the black ribbon was sitting on James's mahogany desk, exactly where he had left it before he sent the messenger out yesterday. Nell picked up the box. She didn't throw it. She didn't shout. She just held it out. "I am returning the dress," Nell said. James swallowed hard. "Nell, I only wanted you to have an advantage in their eyes. I wanted to protect you. Let me stop the story right here. I need to make something perfectly clear, and I need you to listen. There is a deep, insidious danger in a man's pity. When a well-meaning man tries to protect a woman by forcing her to play the role of a helpless victim, he is not respecting her. He is putting her in a cage. Pity cloaks a woman in fine silk, but it demands she shrink herself to fit inside it. True respect doesn't ask a woman to put on a costume to earn her basic human rights. True respect demands that the world looks at her exactly as she is, calluses, dirt, and all, and recognizes her undeniable absolute worth. Nell looked at James. Her eyes were like flint. "My humanity," Nell said, "does not depend on dressing up to satisfy your system." She dropped the box on the desk. A heavy thud. "I don't need to play the part of a fragile, pathetic widow to earn justice," she continued. Her voice was low, vibrating with years of buried anger. "If those men cannot respect me in the clothes that built this town, then their respect is completely worthless. Do not ever try to dress me up for their comfort again." James stared at her. The last wall of his city-bred arrogance crumbled into dust. He didn't see a widow anymore. He didn't see a client. He saw a force of nature. He realized finally and fully that she didn't need a savior. She needed an equal. James stepped around the mahogany desk. He stopped 2 feet from her. His eyes darkened. The soft, polished lawyer disappeared, and the rancher's blood came to the surface. He looked down at the white box. Then he looked back into her eyes. "Then return the name too," James whispered. Nell frowned slightly. Her breath hitched. "What?" James reached into his coat pocket. He pulled out a heavy piece of parchment, the new, officially stamped land deed the board had just signed. He held it out to her. "I mean it," James said. His voice was thick, fervent. "Stop letting them call you a dependent widow. Stop letting them put that title on your life. Give it back to them." He pressed the parchment into her calloused hand. "Take your real name," James said. "Eleanor Ruth Calloway. Sole title holder. Nobody's dependent, nobody's victim. Just you. And the land you conquered." Nell looked down at the paper. There it was, her name. Spelled right, no brackets, no qualifiers. She looked back up at James. For the first time since they met, the tension between them didn't feel like a battle. It felt like an anchor taking hold in deep water. They stood there in the quiet office. 2 people looking at each other without a single lie standing between them. September rolled across the Kansas plains. It brought a cool, dry wind that turned the tall grass the color of old gold. It brought the harvest. And it brought the quiet. The legal victory in August hadn't sparked a parade. Justice rarely comes with a marching band. It usually just comes with a long, heavy exhale. Victor Aldridge was ruined. The State Review Board came down from Topeka. They looked at the ledgers James provided. They stripped Aldridge of his broker's license. He was forced to sell his shipping company to pay the restitutions. He packed a single trunk and took the eastbound train out of Milford in the middle of the night. The Harlan Bank survived, but barely. James spent his days gutting the institution. He fired the tellers who had turned a blind eye. He burned the 1875 charter in the iron stove in the lobby. And Nell got a check for $480. Most folks in town thought they knew what she would do with it. They thought she would buy a new buggy, or hire 2 strong farmhands to do the heavy lifting before winter. Or maybe, finally, buy some nice clothes for herself. They didn't know Nell Calloway. Nell cashed the check on a Tuesday. On Wednesday, she walked into the empty storefront next to Clara Voss's fabric shop. She paid a year's rent in advance. She bought a heavy oak desk. She bought 3 chairs. She bought a shelf full of law books. And she painted a sign on the glass window, the Milford County Land Recording Society. It wasn't a political club. It wasn't a sewing circle. Nell set up a schedule. Every Thursday and Saturday afternoon, she left the ranch in Henry's care, and she sat behind that oak desk. She sat there for Lars Erickson when he brought in his seed contracts. She sat there for Rosa Mendez when she needed to understand her water rights. Nell sat with them. She read the thick, confusing legal English. She translated it into plain, honest truth. She showed them where the traps were hidden in the fine print. She didn't charge them a single penny. "Listen to me. I need to explicitly state why this matters. Pay attention. Changing a broken system does not happen just because one person wins a lawsuit. A single victory is just a spark. Systemic change happens when the person who survives the fire decides to spend their life building a fireproof ladder for everyone else. Equality is only real when knowledge is democratized. By sitting at that desk, Nell was taking the weapon the bank had used against the poor, the weapon of confusing legal language, and she was dismantling it word by word in the broad daylight. That is what true healing looks like. You don't just heal the wound. You make sure the knife can never be used again. On a crisp Friday morning in late October, the Milford County Courthouse was nearly empty. Judge Elias Harding was sitting at his high bench, sorting through land patents. The heavy oak doors opened. Clara Voss walked down the center aisle. Clara was 67 years old. In the 12 years she had lived in Milford, she had never once stepped foot inside the courthouse. She had never spoken in a public forum. She was a woman who lived her life in the quiet safety of cedarwood and fabric bolts. But she walked right up to the wooden railing. "Judge Harding," Clara said. Her voice carried a heavy German accent, but it didn't tremble. Harding looked over his spectacles. "Mrs. Voss, do you have a legal dispute?" "No," Clara said. "I have a testimony." Harding frowned. "There is no trial today, ma'am." "I am not here for a trial," Clara said firmly. She held a piece of paper in her stained hands. "I am here for the historical record of this county. I request to read a statement into the permanent archive." Harding hesitated. But he looked at the set of Clara's jaw. He picked up his pen and opened the heavy leather ledger. "Proceed." Clara stood tall. She read from her paper. "My name is Clara Voss. I am a resident of this county. I submit this statement to testify to the character, the labor, and the integrity of Eleanor Ruth Calloway. For 4 years, I watched her work the land alone. I watched her feed her children. I watched her pay her debts honestly, while dishonest men tried to steal her name." Clara paused. She looked directly at the judge. "I submit this," Clara said, her voice ringing clear against the high ceiling, "so that 50 years from now, when someone opens these books, they do not just see the names of men who sat in offices. I want them to see that a woman stood here. I want them to know she fought, and I want them to know she won. Put it in the ink, Judge." Harding stared at her. He didn't argue. He didn't dismiss her. He dipped his pen. He wrote every single word into the official county record. When he was done, he blotted the page. "It is recorded, Mrs. Voss, in perpetuity." Clara nodded once. She turned and walked out. That evening, the sun set over the Calloway ranch in a blaze of burnt orange and deep violet. Nell stood on her front porch. The air was getting cold. Winter was coming. But for the first time in 5 years, Nell wasn't afraid of the snow. She looked out at the windbreak of maple trees. The leaves were turning bright red. The trees were tall now. Their roots were deep. Henry was in the barn, pitching the last of the hay. Sarah was inside, setting the table for dinner. Nell leaned against the wooden rail. She had spent her whole adult life fighting just to survive, fighting the dirt, fighting the weather, fighting the bank, fighting the whispers in town. But standing there, breathing in the cold, clean air, she realized something profound. The fight was over. She didn't have to clench her jaw anymore. She didn't have to sleep with one eye open, wondering who was coming to take her home. The land was hers. The name on the paper was hers. The future was hers. She heard the crunch of gravel down by the county road. She looked up. A rider was coming up the drive in the fading light. It was a tall man, on a bay gelding. It was James. He wasn't coming to assess the property. He wasn't coming to offer pity. He was just coming to see her. Nell smiled. It was a small smile, just touching the corners of her mouth. But it was real. She wiped her calloused hands on her apron, stepped off the porch, and walked out into the yard to meet him. November in Kansas doesn't arrive quietly. It comes in on a biting wind that strips the last brown leaves from the oak trees. It hardens the mud into jagged ruts. It freezes the water in the troughs before the sun even clears the horizon. By the first week of November, 1888, the Calloway Ranch was fully wintered. Nell had sold her spring calves at top market value. The barn was packed tight with dry hay. The fences were double-wired. The woodpile was stacked high against the cabin wall. She was safe. She was secure. She had built a fortress out of her own sweat, and she didn't owe a single dime to any man on earth. But out in the quiet of the prairie, when the work is finally done, a different kind of silence settles in. A silence that makes you look at the empty chair across the kitchen table. Down in Milford, James McCready was packing boxes. He had spent 3 months cleaning up the mess his father and grandfather had left behind. He had fired the corrupt clerks. He had stabilized the ledgers. The Harlan and Sons Bank was now running on clean, honest math. His job was done. He was a partner in a prestigious law firm in St. Louis. He had a brick townhouse there. He had clients who paid in gold, not in promises or bags of feed. It was time for him to go back to his real life. It was a Tuesday afternoon. The sky was the color of old iron. James was in his office at the bank loading heavy leather-bound law books into a wooden shipping crate. His tailored suit was covered in dust. He heard boots on the hardwood floor. Slow, steady. He looked up. Nell was standing in the doorway. She wore a heavy wool coat. Her cheeks were flushed red from the cold ride into town. She didn't look angry. She didn't look sad. She just looked like a woman who knew exactly what she wanted to say. James put down the book. He dusted off his hands. "Mrs. Calloway," James said. The formality felt strange now, too stiff for the space between them. "You are packing," Nell said. It wasn't a question. "I am," James replied. He looked at the half-empty bookshelves. "The bank is sound. I have a firm in St. Louis that has been operating without me for entirely too long. My train leaves on Thursday." Nell stepped fully into the room. She didn't wring her hands. She didn't look at the floor. She looked him right in the eye. "When you leave on Thursday," Nell said, her voice steady and clear, "are you coming back?" James froze. He looked at her. Really looked at her. "I can come back in the spring," James said carefully, "to check on the bank, to make sure the new manager's holding the line." "That is not what I asked," Nell said. She walked up to his desk. She rested her bare hands on the polished wood. "I am a woman who respects clarity, Mr. McCready," Nell said, "because I have spent my life suffering the consequences of men who speak in half-truths. So I am going to be entirely clear with you." She took a slow breath. "My ranch is sound. My children are fed. If you get on that train and never come back, I will be absolutely fine. I do not need you here to survive." James didn't say a word. He didn't interrupt. He just listened. "But," Nell continued, her voice softening just a fraction, "I want to say this out loud. I see you. I see the man you are. Not the banker who rode into my yard in April with a false map, but the man who sat at my table and admitted his own cowardice. The man who stood beside me and ripped his own grandfather's corrupt legacy down to the studs." She held his gaze. Her eyes were fierce, unflinching. "I see you as a man worthy of my trust," Nell said. "And if you have any intention of coming back to this town and staying in this town, I want to know before you get on that train." She didn't dress it up in poetry. She didn't weep. She didn't bat her eyelashes. She laid her truth on the table like a royal flush, and she dared him to look at it. "Let me stop the story right here. Let me tell you a fundamental truth about love. I need you to hear these exact words. A lot of folks are taught that romance is about rescue. They think romance is about a man giving up his whole world, sacrificing everything he has to save a woman. That is a dangerous, poisonous lie. True love is never a rescue mission. True love is two whole, complete, independent people making an active choice to stand side by side. If a man makes himself a martyr for you, if he sacrifices his dreams to save you, he will eventually expect you to pay off the debt of his sacrifice. An equal partnership requires absolutely no debts. It only requires a mutual, uncoerced choice. Love is not saying, "I cannot live without you." Love is saying, "I can live perfectly well without you, but I actively choose to live my life with you." James McCready understood that truth. He stood in the dusty office. He looked at the woman standing across the desk. He had spent 3 weeks agonizing over this exact moment. He had thought about selling his firm in St. Louis. He had thought about making a grand dramatic gesture, burning his old life down to prove his devotion to her. But listening to her now, he realized how insulting that would be. She didn't want a martyr, she wanted a partner. James smiled, a slow, genuine smile that reached all the way to his eyes. "I am not going to sell my firm in St. Louis, Nell," James said quietly. Nell's expression didn't change. She just nodded, accepting the fact. "All right. I am not going to sell it," James continued, taking a step closer, "because I don't need to give up my life there to build a life here. I am transferring my daily caseload to my junior partner. I will retain a partial ownership to handle appellate work from a distance, but my center of gravity is moving." He stopped right in front of her. "I am getting on that train on Thursday," James said, his voice dropping low, rumbling in his chest. "I am going to pack up my townhouse. I am going to finalize my contracts. And then I am coming back, not to check on the bank, not to check on the town." He reached out. He didn't grab her. He just rested his hand lightly on the desk, inches from hers. "I am coming back to stay," James said, "because I have spent my whole life reading the law in clean, quiet rooms. But you taught me that the truth lives out here, in the dirt, and I don't want to live anywhere else." Nell looked down at his hand. Then she looked up into his eyes. The tension that had carried her through the last 5 years finally completely snapped. Not in defeat, but in relief. "February," Nell said. "February," James agreed. "You had better bring a heavy coat," she whispered. "I'll buy one at Peterson's Mercantile," he replied, a grin breaking across his face. Winter on the prairie is a test of endurance. It buries the roads in drifts of white. It howls through the cracks in the logs. It isolates you. But Nell didn't feel isolated that winter. She felt anchored. She kept holding her hours at the Milford County Land Recording Society. Every Thursday and Saturday, even when the snow was deep, she bundled up and rode into town. She translated contracts. She explained deeds. She taught Lars Erickson how to file a proper tax extension. She kept building her fireproof ladder. And then the calendar turned. February 1889. The deepest freeze began to crack. The snow turned to heavy, wet slush. The sky lifted from iron gray to a pale, piercing blue. On a Tuesday morning, a wagon rolled into Milford. It was loaded with heavy trunks and boxes. James McCready was back. He didn't take an office in the bank. He told the bank manager he had no interest in sitting behind that desk ever again. Instead, he walked down the boardwalk to the empty storefront next to Clara Voss's fabric shop. The storefront Nell rented for her recording society. Nell was sitting inside reading a property statute. The iron stove was throwing off a steady, comforting heat. The bell above the door jingled. James walked in. He was wearing a thick wool coat. His cheeks were red from the wind. He looked heavier, stronger. He looked like he belonged there. Nell stood up. She didn't run to him. She didn't throw her arms around his neck. That wasn't who they were. She just smiled. The kind of smile that lights up a room from the inside out. "You bought a coat," Nell said. "I did," James said, taking off his hat. "It's surprisingly warm." He walked over to her desk. He reached into his leather satchel. He didn't pull out flowers. He didn't pull out a ring. He pulled out a piece of heavy cream-colored paper. He laid it flat on the oak desk in front of her. "I went to the county clerk this morning," James said. "I filed the paperwork. I rented the back half of this building, if you'll have me as a neighbor." Nell looked down at the paper. Down. It was a draft for a legal partnership, a formal business registration. At the top, in crisp black ink, it read, "Callaway and McCready Legal Assistance, Land Rights Consultation, Milford County, Kansas." Nell stared at the words. She traced her finger over the ink. Callaway, her name, her real name, first. "Why is my name first?" Nell asked softly. Because it's alphabetical, James said, his voice entirely deadpan. Nell looked up, raising an eyebrow. And, James added, his expression softening into absolute reverence, because you built this. You built the trust in this community. I just know the Latin. You know the people. I wouldn't dream of putting my name ahead of yours. You earned the lead. Let me give you another truth right here. True equality in a partnership isn't about dividing everything exactly in half. It's about recognizing who carries the weight and honoring it openly. When a man puts a woman's name first on a plaque or in a conversation or in his life, he isn't diminishing his own manhood. He is demonstrating it. A weak man demands the spotlight. A strong man is perfectly comfortable standing in the glow of the woman he respects. Nell picked up the pen from her inkwell. She looked at James. I don't have a law degree, Mr. McCready. Neither did Abraham Lincoln when he started out, James replied easily. Sign the paper, Nell. Let's get to work. She signed it. The next morning, the sun came up over the Callaway Ranch, painting the snow-dusted prairie in streaks of gold and lavender. Nell woke up early, as she always did. She dressed in her heavy work clothes. She pulled on her boots. She walked out onto the front porch. The air was sharp and clean, the smell of pine and cold dirt. She wasn't alone. Down by the front gate, leaning against the wooden rail, was James. He held 2 tin cups. Steam was rising from the hot coffee inside them in thick white plumes. He hadn't knocked. He hadn't demanded to come inside. He was just waiting for her to be ready. Nell stopped on the porch. She looked at the scene in front of her. She remembered the morning in 1878 when she and Thomas had first rolled their wagon onto this exact patch of dirt. It was nothing but wild grass and possibility. Thomas had looked at the empty horizon and asked her, "What do you see?" She had told him, "I see what it could become. 11 years of sweat, 11 years of freezing winters and boiling summers, 11 years of grief and fighting and standing her ground against men who tried to erase her." Now she stood on a solid wooden porch. She looked at the maple trees she had planted with her own 2 hands. They were tall. They were thick. They were breaking the winter wind, just like she knew they would. And standing beneath those trees was a man who saw her exactly as she was. A man who didn't want to put her in a silk dress. A man who handed her a pen and told her to sign her own name. Nell walked down the steps. Her boots crunched in the frozen snow. She walked up to the gate. James handed her a tin cup. Their fingers brushed, warmth against the cold. "Good morning, partner," James said quietly. "Good morning," Nell replied. They stood shoulder to shoulder. They didn't face each other. They faced outward, looking at the land, looking at the cattle, looking at the world they were going to hold together. Because that is what true love looks like out here on the frontier. It isn't 2 people staring into each other's eyes, oblivious to the storm. It is 2 complete, unbroken people, standing side by side, looking outward in the exact same direction, ready to face the weather together. This channel is dedicated to Western storytelling, where we explore tales of cowboys, love on the frontier, motherhood, resilience, and the deep bonds between people in harsh lands. The meaning behind this story reminds us, truth doesn't disappear just because it's ignored, and dignity doesn't need permission to exist. If you enjoyed this journey, don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe. It helps bring more stories like this to life. This work is a creation of the author's imagination, designed to entertain and provoke thought. Any resemblance to real persons, places, or events is purely accidental. The author assumes no responsibility for interpretations that connect fictional elements to real-world entities.
The wind has quieted now over the Kansas plains, but what remains is something far stronger than any storm. This story was never just about a ranch, or a debt, or even a courtroom victory. It was about something deeper, something that lives in the bones of every person who has ever been overlooked, underestimated, or written off by a system that refused to see them. What Nell Callaway proved is that strength does not always look the way the world expects it to. It doesn't wear silk. It doesn't ask for permission, and it certainly doesn't wait to be recognized. Real strength is built in silence, in early mornings before the sun rises, in calloused hands that keep working when no one is watching, and in the quiet decision to stand your ground even when it would be easier to walk away. There is a powerful lesson here about truth, not the kind written neatly in ledgers or signed on paper, but the kind lived every single day. Because systems can be manipulated, numbers can be twisted, but lived truth, real work, real sacrifice, real integrity has a way of surfacing, no matter how deeply it is buried. And when it does, it has the power to change everything. This story also reminds us of the danger of silence. Not just the silence of those who are oppressed, but the silence of those who see the truth and hesitate to act. James McCready's journey teaches us that knowing what is right is not enough. There comes a moment when hesitation becomes complicity, and courage is measured not by what we understand, but by what we are willing to do about it. And perhaps most importantly, this is a story about dignity. Nell did not win because she became what others expected her to be. She won because she refused to become anything less than who she already was. She didn't ask to be saved, she demanded to be seen. And in doing so, she didn't just reclaim her land, she reclaimed her name, her identity, and her place in a world that tried to erase her. But the meaning doesn't end there, because true victory is not just surviving the fight, it's changing the path for those who come after. By sharing her knowledge, by helping others understand the rules that were once used against them, Nell turned her personal battle into something far greater. She transformed pain into purpose, and that is where real legacy begins. So, if there is one thing to carry with you from this story, it is this: your worth is not defined by what others choose to acknowledge. It is defined by what you build, what you endure, and what you refuse to surrender. And sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply stand exactly as you are and say, "This is mine." Out here on the frontier, that kind of truth doesn't fade. It becomes part of the land itself,